So we are going to talk now about funding for the music industry. To talk about this topic, we are talking about, or maybe the guests are going to talk about the separation between finance and funding, because funding is how to fund the money. Finance is also how to manage your money, and especially Alison Wenham, which is a globally respected music industry leader. She is going to teach us with the help of Stuart Dredge, which is a journalist which is specialized in about writing about the music industry. They're gonna teach us how you can manage to be a successful artist and also successfully money-wise in a long term. So to talk about this topic, I welcome to the stage Alison Wenham and Stuart Dredge.
Thank you very much.
Perfect. Hello, here we are. We should say there's three of us in this conversation. Alison's dog has a lot of views on music funding, so you may be hearing from them throughout the course of this as well as us. Pleased to meet you all. Yeah, definitely. Well, but pleased to meet you all, and welcome to this session about music funding, which is coming at the kind of perfect time, given what's happening in the industry at the moment. So in 2021, there have been lots of headlines about sky-high values for music. We've seen famous artists selling their publishing or their recordings catalogs for tens or hundreds of millions of dollars. We've seen investment firms talking about raising billion-dollar funds to buy music rights. We've seen Universal Music go public, worth $53 billion on day one. And all this is great news if you're Lucian Grange or Bob Dylan or Stevie Nicks. But what we want to talk about today is what it means for the rest of the music industry. So if you're an independent label or publishing company, or even a self-releasing artist in the early stages of your career, is this relevant to you, and what should you be doing about it now? And so we're going to zero in on the choices you can make about financing, funding, administration from the earliest days of your journey, and how that can leave you in the best position in the future to realize the value in what you've built. So my name is Stuart. I'm Music Ally's Head of Insight. We do journalism, writing about the music industry. We do training for people within the industry. We work with artists and labels and marketing. We run events. And I'm really excited to be part of this conference because we hear such good reports about the quality of the sessions and the people there. And I'm really sorry that I'm back in the UK, only there virtually, but I'm hoping to come there in person next year. And I'm really delighted to be talking about Alison Wenham about all this, because she is one of the people I've always turned to for wisdom and experience on a lot of these trends that can be super hyped up, but there's always a context, a backstory, and there's always implications. And she's one of my trusted sources. So Alison, I mean, would you like to start by talking a little about your industry journey so far, and kind of give us your backstory to what we're talking about today, and how you've worked your way through the industry?
Yeah, thank you very much, Stuart. And as Stuart said, I do have a dog present. She's very interesting I do, and she's probably got quite a lot of things to say this evening. So if you do hear her snoring or barking, that's because she either agrees or disagrees. So I've been in the music industry all my working life, mostly on the record company side. And for 20 years, I was in the commercial side of the business. So I ran a record company. I sold record company. I ran a distribution company. And I ended up being a managing director at one of the major record companies. And about 20 years ago, I took a leap to found AIM, which is Association of Independent Music, the first independent trade body in the United Kingdom devoted just to the independent music scene. And so one of the first things that we did was to just do some research into the issues. I mean, I knew the issues from my perspective, running an independent company, but I had the opportunity to sell the company. Would I have done that today? That's another debate for another day. But the issues were pretty common around the world. And one of the biggest issues was access to finance. And so we commissioned a report along with our government Department for Culture, Media and Sport. And it was called Banking on a Hit. And it showed that there was a critical lack of investment into the music industry, that the businesses were viable, were well run, had professional qualifications in most of the owner managers or managing directors. It showed that the traditional banking sector had zero interest in the in funding or making loans to independent record companies. And it was a really, really strong report in favour of investment into the music industry. Several years later, I retitled it Banging On a Bit, because it just did not move the needle. And I think that, Stuart, we should talk about why what's going on today is going on. If we can.
Yeah, definitely. Well, let's start with the big picture then, because like there will be all these stories. I've written quite a few of them about it is 7, 8, 9 digit sums, lots of money being paid for catalogs. It feels like a boom time at a certain level of the industry for big catalogs, big artists. So what is going on around there, and why, around the value of music, and why suddenly we are hearing about people paying so much money for rights?
Well, I think the reason is in, you know, the findings of Banking on a Hit, and why it met with a stone cold response from, you know, traditional banking industry and angel investors and just about any venture capital, any investment house. And it basically was because the industry was way too unstable. As a physical industry, this is well, it was obviously just at the dawn of the internet age. You know, and the cloud of piracy hadn't even pushed our star down further at that time. It was simply that in a physical world, you had very little time to establish a success with your artist. You had a 3-month window if you were lucky. And if you, as we say, got one away and you did have commercial success, that would be one in a sea of things that just did not get any oxygen in the consumer market. It did not get racked in the local record stores. It did not get played on the radio. And these were the only channels, apart from live, that you could really connect to your audience. So we were looking at very narrow pipes down which an awful lot of music was being pushed. And obviously in that scenario, the bigger the budget, the better you stood a chance of getting traction with the consumer market. So if you come forward now, skip the piracy bit and look at why looks like tens of billions of dollars are now being invested in the music industry. And it's really a very simple thing. It's called streaming. It's one of the first reasons why streaming has presented a much more stable market. It just has. Once things are working on the streaming platforms, they tend to stay pretty well where, you know, where their interests first lay. You can go up or down a bit, but it does mean that the streaming market has really stabilized the whole pattern of income. The second reason is that we're looking now at a global market. You know, in the old days, you talked about 6 territories being of interest. Now you're looking at any territory where you can introduce your band, maybe get some live gigs, maybe get some exposure. You're seeing giants coming on stream with China and with India, with the Middle East. You know, they're not going to be necessarily as big as the US market, but you know, the opportunity to have trading partners there, which could be Spotify or Apple or could be local licensees, is now a realistic possibility. And the third reason is that I think I know there is no global copyright law, but we are looking now at a market which has global copyright management. So 20 years ago, it was much cheaper. It was much better for China if music and other IP-based products like films were sold in streets. It was basically a black economy, and there was no copyright law to speak of. It wasn't rated, it wasn't ranked as being of any economic value at all, so it just didn't get any attention. Now we're looking at a wake up and sort of smell the coffee moment where people are realizing that, you know, you've got big businesses here. And if you look at Tencent and NetEase, you know, there you have prime examples of big businesses built in China around IP-based products, music in their case, and video and other sorts of things. So I think that, you know, as we see that piracy has not gone away, but those markets are what was the word there? They're coming over to the sort of the right side of copyright law, and that just offers more and more opportunities. So I think that the fourth reason is the explosion of things like Netflix, Apple TV, Prime. You know, music feeds so many of those experiences, audiovisual experiences. So there's an awful lot of market opportunity there in this what we call the sync market.
And I guess no one likes to think of themselves as predictable, but there is predictability here, isn't there? Like, you can, if you have a catalog, people can model it and say, well, we think this is the revenue for the next 2, 3, 5 years. Which is that something that was harder in the past? Like, if you were an investment company coming in, you can now look ahead and say, well, if I spend this much on this bag of rights, I can hopefully expect this return.
I mean, it was really a crapshoot back in the day. You know, I had my own catalogue valued in about 1990, 1989. And a British bank valued it at 0. And an American bank valued it at £34 million. Right? Now, there you have, you know, a prime example of how music had no recognized value, and it was through the lens of whoever was valuing it. The American market has always been more predisposed towards copyright businesses because of Hollywood. So, you know, they've got skin in the game there. So they've been more inclined to look at IP-based businesses as having value. But yeah, it was just it was pretty hopeless to see any sort of value. Now they're saying that music is more valuable than oil, maybe more valuable than cocoa beans. And yeah, it is a bit boring, but I mean, I'm glad that we're there in a way, because having worked for 40 years in the business, I've always known that we've worked in a really, really valuable industry culturally, but now we're recognizing the economic value as well. And it's a first.
I mean, definitely, and that exciting. So I mean, I guess let's drill down then, because I guess we're talking about these big sums, big catalogs, but I think the audience watching now, from what I know, is kind of more towards the kind of the grassroots industry, people who are sort of founded labels, who are running management companies, who may be artists. So has the funding environment for these people changed that much? Because I feel like in the old days there was a lot of scraping things together. If you were founded a label, or if you're an artist, you would scrape together the money from wherever you could to put things out and record music. And I mean, has that changed much?
Well, I think that the short answer to that is probably no. I mean, I'm assuming we don't have Lucian Grange in the audience, and I'm assuming we don't have Bob Dylan in the audience. I'm assuming that in the audience, and I'm very sorry we can't be there today, but as Stuart says, hopefully next year. You know, we had a conversation about this before this panel, because, you know, we could waffle on about multiples and you know, leverage and all that stuff, and it wouldn't have been of much interest to the audience, because I'm pretty sure that you all are looking for ways to be financed, to you know, to attract financing. So I think in the early stages of any sort of green shoots business, whether you're an artist or whether you're a little record label or a little publishing company, is probably the same as it ever was. And it's called, colloquially, it's called the bank of mum and dad. You know, it's colloquially who can you get to put some money in. It could be, you know, the bank of mum and dad, it could be friends, you could remortgage your house. When we researched how people funded their startups back in 2000, you know, we found that, you know, 7% of our members had remortgaged their homes in order to raise a lump sum. So this is all before you have attracted interest from a third party. So this is, you've got to get in there, you know, you've got to get on the stage, you've got to get some sort of commercial attention, some sort of established commercial presence before anybody is going to come along and, you know, offer you money to do more of what you do well. And of course, you know, that do well is always a very subjective thing, because, you know, doing well is what genre you're in, how well you identify your audience, how well you use all the tools that are available to, you know, to build audience and therefore build value. But I think the short answer is that, you know, there are crowdfunding platforms, there are smart ways of raising money through live, not necessarily at the event, but raising, you know, gathering together all the people that attend a live gig and turning them into your marketing team, etc., etc. There's lots of things you can do. But in the early stages, I suspect, and I'd love to hear from the audience if I'm wrong, that is pretty much the way it's always been. If you're in absolute startup mode and you haven't got you know, a rich mum and dad, then you're really scratching to put any sort of budget together.
No, definitely. It'd be amazing if Bob didn't enter the chat now. He is watching. Has some questions. I mean, so one thing I wanted to talk about is, I guess at the top end of this boom in catalogue buying it's people selling their rights, isn't it? It's songwriters selling their publishing rights to big companies who are investing in them. But it's coming at a time when I think at the grassroots side of the market, we're hearing more conversation about should you give up your rights? Should you sell your rights if a label wants to work with you? And it's not a contradiction in a way. Like if you hold on to your rights, you can sell them when you're as big as Bob Dylan later, and that there's no kind of, those two things fit together. But how are you thinking about this idea of the value exchange between traditionally a lot of funding, whether you're a musician, has come with the string of, well, you are going to give up something as part of that, of, you know, ownership of your rights. How is that changing? How do you see that kind of shifting about in the light of what's happening in the market and the value of music?
Well, because if you are lucky enough to progress to a level where you are offered an advance, and I think that's why this session is so very important, because one, everybody in this audience is so much more informed than artists and record companies were 20, 30, 40 years ago. I mean, so much more informed. And there are so many more ways of running a business in the music space than there was 20, 30 years ago. So, you know, the message from me is if somebody comes along with a big fat check, think very, very carefully. I mean, yes, it will make you feel good for a day or two. You've made it. Somebody else wants to work with you, but think so carefully, because any advance that comes from, you know, a larger company comes with obligations, comes with expectations. An advance is nothing more than a loan. It sounds like something different, but it's nothing more than a loan. We're going to get in a little bit later to how boring the music industry can be, but how much I advocate being bored, because if you don't read the contract, if you don't pay attention to what you're signing at this particular stage, you only have yourself to blame later on. There's so much in the way of seller remorse. There's so much in the way of, you know, big bands that, you know, moan a lot about the bad deals that they did, when in fact, if somebody had actually paid a lot of attention to what they were signing, then maybe they shouldn't have signed it. Now today, you don't need to sign it. You may want to sign it, and it may be absolutely the right thing for you to do. You may need a big budget. You may need a big record company. But, you know, think very carefully, read the small print, get advice, and try and remove as much as you can of the stuff that you don't like, because, you know, is it a buyer's market? Is it a seller's market? You've got to sit which side of the fence that you're on. And if you have any negotiating strength, use it right at that point. If a distributor wants to work with you and wants to make an advance, that's great. But same message, read the contract, look at the end date, look at the termination provisions. Is it exclusive? How much are you giving? Are you giving everything? You're giving your sync rights, your physical, your digital rights. You know, all of these things are negotiable if you feel empowered to negotiate them. You know, you are not unempowered at this point because somebody has come along to work with you. So take that opportunity as empowerment on your side of the fence and drive as hard a bargain as you dare. Owning rights is it's quite clear from the appetite for acquiring music rights now from investment institutions that music rights are incredibly, incredibly valuable. And when you sign them away, whether it's under a contract or however you do it, whether you sell them, bear in mind that at that point you have given up the long-term benefit. You will have short-term benefits, and they may be 10 years, 5, 10, 15, 20 years. But in the long term, and I'm talking about your children, you may not have any children yet, but when you do, or if you do, or, you know, you will not have the luxury of wondering what to do with them when you're 50 or 60 or 70, because somebody else will own them outright. And I will just drop in here also the moral right, you know, because if you do sell your rights and you don't protect how they can be used, then you might find that, you know, there are uses for your music that you morally find unacceptable to you. You know, there are just certain, we always call it the sausages problem. It's like the Paul McCartney track with being used for Linda McCartney's, you know, vegetarian sausages ad. You know, if somebody took Paul McCartney and used them for wall sausages, that family would have found that insulting. But once you sold them, you have no say over what happens to them.
No, definitely. I mean, I'm kind of interested in the
But sorry, can I just say, I did write here, no, this is not a one size fits all, this bit of the conversation, because you know, we don't know at what stage people are in the development, but there is no sort of overwhelmingly it's not one answer to one question. You have to judge it according to where you are in the music industry. Sorry.
I mean, the other thing I find interesting as well is I think it's not like a labels owning rights is evil, advances are terrible. Like for a lot of independent labels, the ownership in that catalog is how they survive and how they invest in artists. It's like there's a balance, isn't there, to be struck here? I guess it's not just about every artist should have all their rights and then labels will have to just deal with that. I sort of see some other debate in those terms. Like labels do good things with the ownership of rights they have too.
Labels do great things with the ownership that they have, you know, and you need to have a good team around you if you're going to be successful in this industry. You know, I make that statement with no qualifications. No, I'm not qualifying that statement at all. You need a good team around you if you're going to be successful in the music industry. You know, as an artist, whether that's a management team that has a record company attached to it, whether that's a record company and a manager, an agent, you know, all of those things are movable pieces around the board. But doing it all yourself is extremely difficult and unlikely to lead to, you know, to huge success. You can be modestly successful. I mean, there are artists who have, you know, run businesses all by themselves, build their fan base. They can send birthday cards to all of their fans, and they run a business which pays their mortgage. And, you know, I mean, what is success? You know, success is being able to pay your bills, being able to enjoy the lifestyle that you want. Not a lot more than that.
Yeah, definitely. Well, let's talk about some of the alternatives. I think that's the interesting part of this, the options that are emerging if you're in startup mode. And one thing I've sort of noticed is people often tend to jump on something and say, this is the thing now. Labels are dead because Amanda Palmer has done loads of crowdfunding, or labels are dead because you can directly distribute, and we tend to sort of say this new thing is the one thing. And like you say, it's not a one size fits all. But what are the most exciting alternatives, I guess, to traditional funding that you see emerging? I mean, we've talked about export agencies working with artists. We've talked about crowdfunding. What's interesting you, I suppose, about what's coming through?
Well, I mean, I guess that the audience is mostly from Germany. I may be wrong, but mostly from Germany. You know, I always think the German market's always been pretty well organised. I'm going to talk more about the British market because I'm more experienced in that. But, you know, I would say to anybody from whatever country you're from, one of the first things you should do is join your local trade association, because, you know, you've got a great trade association in VUT in Germany. They know their way around the record industry and the publishing as well, but, you know, at the back of their hand. They can be enormously helpful to you in times of trouble, you know, advice, troubleshooters, information, contacts, links around the world. You know, the first thing you could do, it's not expensive, is to join your trade association. They can then put you in touch with things like music export agents and grants. We have in the UK since about 2015 the Music Export Fund, which puts £1 million a year into helping artists to tour abroad, helping artists to, you know, to get out of our country and into other countries. You know, music export offices around the world have always really pulled their weight when it comes to getting artists into other countries, because traveling can be expensive. The PRS Foundation, which is, you know, Performing Rights Society, PPL, you know, they're terrific at supporting emerging artists with funding. You know, there are angel investors. So, you know, there's a lot of, there's Arts Council or the equivalent thereof. So, you know, there's lots of public money from government through bodies like the Arts Council or through the Music Export Fund. And the Trade Association, you know, can be your friend in need, and it can be an incredible resource for you just to build your knowledge base and also to network. You know, the industry might have gone digital, but people still make it get up in the morning, I think.
No, definitely. And we're seeing that now, I think, with everyone flocking back to meet each other at conferences.
Yeah.
One of the companies you're working with, I know, is the Music Credit Fund. And I think when we wrote about the launch of that, the kind of message is you can actually get advances from sources without giving up your rights. Is that something we're going to see more of? That idea of an advance being something that doesn't necessarily involve rights ownership. It just involves, it's about your future royalty streams, or there are other ways to kind of front cash without taking slice. Is that something we're going to see more of, do you think?
I think so, yeah, and I hope so. I mean, it's just absolutely great that my banging on a bit moment back in 2001 is finally, you know, being pushed back in favour of lots of options, lots of choices about, you know, you've got a basket of rights, what do you want to do with them? So let's say you're an owner manager, you may have been in business for 30, 40 years, you don't want to sell your company, you have pride in the independent status of your company, but you don't really have an exit strategy. You know, how are you going to realise some value? Well, you know, the Music Credit Fund would be ideal for that, because you do not sell your rights. If we end up owning rights, we will have failed to do the due diligence properly on the company. You know, we have no ambition to own rights at all. In fact, we would see that as a failure. But we want to replace sometimes onerous advances. You know, if you have value in the catalogue, you have value in the catalogue. We have no interest at all in the you know, the supply chain that you want to build or you have built. We just simply want to offer an alternative that comes at, you know, an interest rate of, you know, 7%. We will do loans of up to 10 years. We do not want any personal guarantees. We want to secure our loan against the royalty streams that your company enjoys. And I will emphasize that, you know, they are critical. You have to have royalty streams, and they've got to be more than 3 years old. I mean, we can refer you to other companies that we work with, one particularly in the US, for small, we only do $2 million and above, but we can refer you to companies in the States that do $50,000. Which is obviously much more of an entry-level loan, but they also will want to see royalty streams by way of security. So, you know, as I stress, it's not for startups, but it is for companies in growth mode who've got a stable business, want to grow, want to maybe acquire a catalogue or sign an artist. It's also for companies that maybe want to restructure their business, buy out advances, you know, bring rights back, all that sort of thing. And yeah, I think we're going to see a lot more people in this space. I mean, Blackstone has just entered for acquisition. Most people are coming in on the acquisition side, going to get quite crowded there, I think. I think we are standing alone as being, you know, not interested in owning your rights, just want you to do well, and we can give you a good push in the back to help you to grow quicker than you would otherwise.
Interesting. Well, can we talk about this idea of the future value? Because again, all these stories are about famous songwriters who are later on in their careers. I don't want to say at the end of their careers, because many of them are still writing and recording, but people, you know, the Bob Dylans, the Stevie Nicks, the ones who've got a big back catalogue. But there's only a finite supply, I guess, of those people. So what happens next? Do you think these investors who've been buying up big catalogs are then going to come looking for the catalogs of artists further down the tree, independent labels? Like, is there going to be a next phase, I suppose, of people buying up rights from different kinds of rights holders and artists?
Well, I mean, I think we probably both of us would say that, you know, what we think about it is speculative because we don't really know. But my hunch is that there are only so many Bob Dylans, there are only so many, you know, Stevie Nicks. But where you've got a catalogue that doesn't necessarily have any big names in it, but is nonetheless producing consistent income, then I think they will be of interest to investors to acquire. Because, you know, it's not, I mean, there is a certain sort of star value about saying, you know, I've just done a deal with Bob Dylan, I've just done a deal with, you know, Leonard Cohen. I've just, you know, there is a sort of star quality there about that. But, you know, once you've worked your way through the sort of superstars, then it's going to come down to a business that doesn't necessarily have that wow moment, but does deliver exactly the same in relative terms. So long as it's stable, it will be of interest.
I was doing some talks recently about looking at the fitness startup space and fitness tech and the kind of catalogs those companies want. It's nice to have the big stars, but actually what they want is music that fits their purpose, whether that's doing workouts or, and for them, they're saying, well, actually independent dance labels were interested in them. They want music that works really well if you're working out. And so they're not necessarily looking big stars. So there's value being generated by catalogs, like you say, that below the superstar level. And I guess that at some point an investor is going to go, well, actually, I can see these independent labels. There's a value there, and I can predict their model, and they're of interest to me now.
Yeah, I mean, it's the same in the audiovisual space. It's the same in TV. You know, with so many new series coming along from Amazon and Netflix and so on and so forth, you know, they are often much more interested in finding what they call cool music that nobody knows and that they can sort of be responsible for bringing to a wider audience. You know, they love that kind of moment where something takes off because it was included in, you know, a Netflix series or something like that. I mean, that's obviously down to the music supervisors on the job, but you know, there's a lot of opportunity. There's a huge amount of opportunity there. I mean, I've heard of companies recently who, you know, these are big independent companies. They have maybe 4 or 5 people in their sync team now. And they tell me that every time they add another person and they think, oh, you know, we've got to cover the salary of adding another person, they add another person, and actually that person generates 5 times their salary in income from the sync market. So it really is a fantastically busy and burgeoning market.
No, definitely. Well, we've got to get into what you kind of trailed as the boring bit, which may have made everyone instantly click away. But I think what we've been talking about is the idea that there is value in a music catalogue at all levels, and that whether it's people coming to offer you funding to help your company grow, whether it's people coming wanting to buy your catalogue, like this, it may be coming ahead for a lot of companies who might be listening to this, in whether it's in a year's time, 2-3 years' time. And for artists, similar, you know, at some point their catalogue may have a value that they could realize. So what are the key things people should be doing now? Because I feel like it's not that people bumble along and then suddenly get offered $10 million and set up, and that's brilliant, is it? There's kind of there's things you can do to make the later opportunities flow more easily, I guess, is the way of putting it.
Well, I mean, sometimes people do come along and offer 10 million for something that, you know, you haven't kept any paperwork around, you know, cash money sort of moments, but they're few and far between. And this is the boring bit. This is the incredibly boring bit that I have, you know, I just know from my own experience, and I know from running a trade association for 20 years, that the independent sector can be really appallingly bad at the administration side of their business. You know, when I do mentoring, I often say to the companies, you know, don't employ people who are like you. because somebody's got to do the VAT return, somebody's got to do the metadata, somebody's got to record who was in the studio when you made that record. Because you'd be amazed how many old recordings of, you know, that are successful still, you know, catalogue classics. They don't even know who was in the studio playing on the track. And there is such a thing as equitable remuneration, which you cannot gift away. You know, if you were in the studio playing the bass, and that earns money over 70 years, the bass player has a right to equitable remuneration for 70 years. So I always, you know, preach that at the beginning of life, don't just employ people who are a lot like you if you're not good at that side of things. If you are good at that side of things, great. You know, wildly entrepreneurial people tend to rather have a bad attitude towards administration, as if it's too unimportant, it's too uninteresting. If that's the case, fine, but make sure somebody else does it. Because so many companies come to grief because nobody did it. Now, if you're coming into this business, you know, the things that you need to do, you know, make a record of who is making the record. You know, ISRCs, you know, follow them assiduously, follow them, because if you go to a distributor or you go to another company to work with your catalogue, they may well put their own ISCs on it. So going back to the contract point that I made earlier, you know, terminations, you know, when that contract terminates, you might change distributor. What are you going to do about the fact the ISRC is with the distributor that you've just left? You know, all of these things add up and they come back to bite you, because they will depreciate the value of what you have created. And I can absolutely tell you without any question of a doubt that there is a huge amount of money sloshing around in the industry because of the lack of attention to this kind of detail. There's a platform called Shout4, which is a contracts platform. You know, do you have a contract at all with your artists? It's a pretty basic step just to say who's going to get what. But you'd be amazed again at how many people don't have contracts. And once, you know, where there's a hit, there's a rip. It's an old-fashioned saying, but it's still the same. If you didn't sort this stuff out early on, then when it's too late, as in you've got a major success on your hands, then, you know, you're going to be in trouble, and there's going to be a lot of angry people around you. So ISRCs, you know, contracts, end dates, termination provisions, blockchain and NFTs, you know, those are new sort of control, new disciplines coming along to help you. I'm not going to talk about them because I still don't quite understand it, but, you know, I'm getting there. But let me tell you, if you don't do those things, if the day comes when somebody wants to buy your catalogue and you go into due diligence, it's going to be a nightmare for you, because you cannot prove that you own what you say you own. And the value of what you've created will be depreciated by a huge amount. And there'll be caveats, and there'll be provisions, and there'll be liabilities should you sell something that you actually didn't own. And if you sell something that you actually didn't own, or you only part owned, and the person who you had the deal with at the time, or you didn't have the deal with at the time, but you thought you had the deal at the time, comes hopping up at that point, says, excuse me, you know, you just made 100 million, where's mine? You really just want to avoid all of that mess by making sure that at the start of life, somebody is going to do the grunt work around metadata creation, you know, performance to contract, termination of contract, having a contract, basic stuff, Stuart.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because I love those stories where an artist goes, we didn't have a deal, we just shook hands over a beer because I trusted them and then we had a wonderful relationship. And I love those stories in the mythology of music. But like you say, that's something that if someone else comes along later on and you're like, yeah, we just shook hands over a beer, it becomes a real problem, doesn't it? And it becomes painful.
I always said in all of the companies that I've been involved with, the only thing that somebody's going to buy you for a beer is another beer.
That's a good rule of life.
Yeah.
But not obligatory. I mean, one thing that sparked in my mind was, we talked earlier on about the idea of who owns the rights. I mean, do you think that labels and artists, when they sit down to do those deals initially, are they going to be thinking more about that? Well, one day someone may want to buy this catalog. Let's lay the groundwork now for that. Because I guess if you're a label and you own the rights and you sell them to someone else, even if you have the right to because you own them, it can cause headaches for those artists. Is it going to become more part of the right from day one? Well, look, if and when this happens, here's how we're going to approach it, and here's how you'll be rewarded, and here's the fair splits.
Well, I think the answer to that's quite simple. It just depends on your bargaining power. You know, if you have no bargaining power, then you're not going to be able to argue that you should own the rights. You may still want to do that, and I still think you should do that, because funnily enough, if you do argue it, then people might actually see your point of view. It depends on how, you know, how you see your career in this industry in 50 years' time. You know, I'm lucky enough to have that perspective because I've been in this industry all this time. But I know most people who attend conferences in the audience will be starting their journey. So I hope they'll sort of think about that. You know, what do I want to be in 50 years' time? You know, if I'm lucky enough to be in here as an artist, as an executive, as a manager, as a publisher, what do I want to have achieved? And you can deviate all the time you want, but I think having some idea about the day after, the day after, the day after tomorrow is wise early on in your career, because we're at a stage in the industry's life where there's so many different ways to slice a deal. There's so many different ways to enter the market. And one size doesn't fit all, as I said earlier. And it may be that one avenue that you explore doesn't work for you. It doesn't mean all the other avenues have been closed off to you. Whereas in the old days, if you had a run at a record company and it didn't work, then largely speaking, you know, your career would be over.
Yeah. Whereas now, like you say, options.
As we get close to the 6 o'clock, do you have any questions? Oh, here he is.
Yeah.
Hello.
JP, hello. You may be on mute, though.
You're on mute.
Yes, hello. You said you mentioned question, I pop up, and I pop up. So I was really enjoying the talk, but while I was listening, I have a couple of questions. One of them is like, you were talking about having right on your own music. And one of the points that you brought up, it was about moral right. Can I ask you what moral right in music are?
Yes, well, if you go to France, there is in law a moral right for an artist, and it cannot be waived. So that moral right is a very, very important part of French culture. And it has been adopted in other countries, but maybe not as a full law. But the moral right is the right to protect your image and what happens to your music. So in France, the moral right is a very, very strong right of any creator. Very strong.
But what does it mean, what happens to my music? What happens to my music once I'm dead? Or what happens to my music in general?
What happens during your life, as well as when you're dead. Yeah, so it's what I was saying earlier about your music not being used for something you find personally unacceptable. I mean, if you're a green campaigner, and a lot of artists are, you wouldn't necessarily want your music to be used to promote BP or Shell or Esso or one of the petrol companies, one of the big, polluting companies, that sort of thing. But if you sell, then it's an interesting question, actually. I guess you do still have a moral right. It's an interesting question.
Thank you. And another question that I had is, like, there was a moment that you said that, like, some and that music has a bigger value than before.
I'm sorry. You dropped out just when you were asking the question. Could you ask it again?
So, yes. Basically, you were saying something about music having a bigger value, or maybe people understanding that the music has a bigger value today than it ever had before. Yeah. But you said you're in the business for 40 years, but in the last 30, 40 years, like the music industry, the music business has always been a multi-billion-dollar business. So like that's why I don't understand what you meant with having more value music now than ever.
No, the word that I need to add to it is recognized value. We always had that value, and in fact, the industry was a lot bigger in the physical world than today. You know, I think it was about 40-something billion on the record industry side, and we're currently at 39 billion. So we've still got some way of catching up before we even reach the value, the income that we generated back in 1998 or whatever. But what I'm really talking about is the recognized value that other industries, the finance industry has finally recognized that the music industry has a value that it can engage with, because it wouldn't.
So you're talking then about the recognized value from other sector of industry,
Correct.
from other industries.
Yeah.
Because
Correct.
at the end, the specialists, the people that has always been specialists in the industry, they have always recognized the value of music because they invested a lot of money. Okay.
Yeah.
And also, like, I was thinking, like, it cannot be the moral value, because moral value has always had music, because we still listen to music of 40, 50, 60 years ago, because they are like milestone for our life today, from John Lennon to Tina Turner to like Cher or all of the artists.
Yeah, well, I mean, one of the differences today to, the 50s, 60s and 70s is that when we grew up, we defined our generation by making sure that our parents hated what we listened to. It was our music, it wasn't their music. They had their fuddy-duddy music and we had our cool music. And the idea that your father could like what you were listening to was just like the worst thing. Whereas today, I think all of those boundaries have gone away, because people of any age can discover any music on any platform. It's all available. I mean, that's the wonderful thing about the today music industry, which is that we no longer define our generations by wearing a particular badge of honor, which is my badge and definitely not your badge.
Well, in this last few months alone, I've written about, I think ABBA, the Beatles, and Led Zeppelin have all joined TikTok in the last few months, because that's how they find that new audience of kids, and then those kids go and stream their music, and it's the barriers are completely down there.
But wouldn't you have died if some time ago that would have been that your dad would come in whistling a song that you wouldn't you just been like, oh my God?
I have one last question, and this last question will be like, you were talking before about something that is very wise, actually, which is like, give a look to the contract, read the contract that you're signing, and if you don't like something, have it take it off.
Yeah.
But when you are, let's say, at the beginning of your career, and you are sitting with maybe a major music industry, and they're making you some sort of pressure on signing a contract, how can you use the power? Because at the end, the power of your music, you own it, but you don't have the money. So how can you find the strength, the courage to say, okay, I rather have these taken off the contract?
Well, my advice there would be, have the courage, because if somebody is interested in signing you, that interest is very valuable, but it's valuable to them and it's valuable to you, which means that you have a negotiating position. If you just act flattered, you want to sign me, isn't this wonderful, where do I sign? You are throwing away a moment. And in the contract, by the way, if you're an artist, it will say that you will have taken legal advice. It will absolutely say that in the contract.
Yes, and, of course.
And if you don't take legal advice, then it doesn't matter whether you did or you didn't, because you signed a contract saying that you did. So,
yeah, the thing is, like, I'm trying to find not a legal talk with you right now, but more of like a moral way, or a real way for giving sort of power to people signing a contract to say, okay, I'm gonna own to my music and my rights instead of signing the contract, and I'm gonna have to be stronger than that. Because like now it's different because we are in a streaming world. Like if I do a song, I can upload it on Spotify and I can put it on YouTube, so somebody's going to listen to it. But as 20 years ago, it was not the case. It was either you find someone that signs you, or nobody will ever know what you did.
Yeah, but you've just said it yourself, and I said earlier, there isn't a one-size-fits-all answer to this. There are many, many avenues to market these days. There's many, many ways to find an audience that loves what you do. So, you know, if somebody wants to work with you, whether it's a record company or distributor, and you don't like the terms, you feel that they're taking too much off the table or off your table and onto their table, then why not shop around a little and see what other deals there might be? Because if that interest is firm, there'll be interest elsewhere.
Okay, so our time is up. I cannot thank you enough for having this talk and having this conversation at the end. And it has been an honor for me to talk to you both and to have you part of Most Wanted Music 2021.
Well, thank you for having me.